Hey everybody, welcome to Your Move. I'm Andy Stanley. What do you wonder? Yeah, what do you wonder? Sam Harris says we should pay attention to the frontiers of our ignorance, and I think that's great advice, which leads us to wonder. So let's talk about wonder right here on Your Move.
What do you wonder?
That's a good question.
With the question, what do you wonder? I mean, we could go really, really deep into this.
I wonder how long I'm gonna have on this earth and if I'll accomplish my purpose.
I wonder why people complain all the time.
I wonder where I'm gonna be at in the next 5 to 10 years.
I wonder if my kids are going to have a good life.
What do we wonder about him? I wonder when he's going to start to lose some weight.
Yeah, I wonder.
So, what do you wonder? What do you wonder? Perhaps this is one of the greatest things about being alive and being human, and if you're a Christian like me, you believe this is a gift God gave humanity. If you're not a Christian or not even a theist, I'm sure you have a theory as to how this happened, but what's undeniable is you have the ability, and I have the ability, we have the capacity to wonder. And sometimes our wonder leads to fear, and sometimes our wonder leads to joy, and sometimes our wonder just leads to more wonder. My wife, Sandra, her grandmother lived to be 100 years old. And we would go visit her, and when we would leave, I would say to Sandra, I wonder what she wonders about. That's what I would say. I wonder what she wonders about. I wonder what she thinks about. When you're 100 years old and you're looking into the future and there's just not a lot of future left, probably, what do you wonder about? She was alive from President Taft to President Obama. Think of all the wondering through all of those years and how what she wondered about changed through the years. What do you wonder about? What did you wonder about? And what did you wonder about that you don't wonder about anymore because you figured it out? So there's no wonder, but now there's new wonder. Truth is, we all wonder, and we all wonder through a frame of reference, some sort of context. It's sort of, in a sense, there's a sense in which we look out this imaginary window and we wonder what's on the other side as it relates to faith, as it relates to the future, our children, just all the kinds of things that human beings wonder about. And the reason that we wonder is because our frame of reference or our window, the reason that we wonder is our frame of reference or our window, it doesn't provide us with all the answers. And as our frame of reference changes, and as we grow older, as we're more educated, as we have more experiences, some of the mysteries in life are resolved, but every time one is resolved, it leads to more wonder. Now, the truth is, all of us have a frame of reference. All of us have a framework or a frame of reference that helps us make sense out of life and helps us make decisions that make sense. You have one. We all have one. It may not be very defined. You may not be able to come up here and tell us what your frame of reference is for life, but you have one. It's your frame of reference that determines for you right from wrong, just from unjust, important versus what's not important, fair versus not fair. It's your frame of reference that determines what you believe. It's your frame of reference that determines to some extent how you should behave, not how you do behave, but how you should behave. And it also determines what you think you can hope for and what's worth hoping for. The other thing about all this is that most of us inherit this, right? And we're not a blank slate. By the time we're children, somebody has begun shaping and forming our frame of reference, how we view the world, the window through which we interpret the circumstances and the events of life. If you're like me, perhaps you were raised with a religious framework, or maybe you were raised with a kind of religious framework, or maybe you were raised with a purely academic framework, that it's all about the head, it's all about the mind, or even more specific, a scientific framework, or perhaps a combination of those two. Or maybe a moralistic framework, or almost a legalistic framework, where you were taught this is how you behave, this is how you behave. Your entire framework for life was behaving the right way. You have to behave correctly. Or perhaps it was opportunistic. That is, you look out for yourself. Always look out for yourself. Nobody else is going to look out for you. Or perhaps even though the term wasn't used, it was more like karma, that stuff happens for a reason. Or maybe fate, stuff happens for no reason. But to some extent, whoever raised you within the context of some framework, and they handed this off to you. And all of us, because we were children, what did we do? We adopted it. And then as we got older, and as we went to school, and as we learned, and as we realized how much smarter than our parents we were, we began to adapt it. And then some of us realized our parents were smarter than we thought they were, and we went back to their original framework and readopted it. But some of you, some of us, perhaps many of us, abandoned it. And the reason we abandoned it is because as we experience life, and as we begin to continue to grow, and as we continue to learn, much of the framework we were handed, much of the framework that we were given, that we inherited, it just didn't make sense anymore. It just didn't line up with reality anymore. And when life doesn't make sense, or when life doesn't add up with our framework, it leaves us wondering. And it's disturbing. If you've ever learned something or observed something or experienced something that just didn't line up with the way you thought the world worked, it's very disturbing. It's bewildering. And not only does it leave us wondering, when it comes to our personal lives and when it comes to our personal behaviors and when it comes to the way that we manage life and our relationships, sometimes it leaves us wandering. Like a dog that suddenly got off the leash. Like the canary that, suddenly was out of the cage. And the truth is, and most of our experience attests to the fact that when we wander, we do not generally wander in good directions. So for the next few weeks, I want to talk to those of you who would say, you know what, I was raised with some sort of religious framework. Maybe it was Christianity, maybe it was some other religion, but it was some sort of theistic framework. Maybe it was very specific, maybe it was ill-defined. But over time, life just didn't line up with what you were taught, with what you believed, with what maybe the church presented to you. And over time, you lost your faith. And maybe you can remember that tension on the inside. It was a little bit disconcerting. In fact, maybe you went through a phase where you actually defended the religious framework that you were brought up with. And while you were defending it, you were questioning it all at the same time. And then you would lay in bed at night, and what would you do? You would wonder. And you would think about this new information, the book that you read, the article you were given, the hypocrisy perhaps you saw at home, or maybe the hypocrisy that you saw at church. And at first, the tension, it was very disconcerting. And then, when you finally gave up your religious framework, it felt so liberating. You were free, and you were so smart, and you had more information than your parents, and you could argue circles around your friends, and suddenly a whole world opened up to you that was so much larger than the religious world that you were brought up in. And then, the wandering began, didn't it? It always does. Because oftentimes wonder leads to wonder. It doesn't have to. But whenever we let go of a framework that we grew up in, wondering always leads to wondering. It always leads to wandering because as we develop a new framework, a new worldview, or a new you view, we begin to try to match our behaviors with the framework that we've adopted. It's just human nature to do so. So, as we move toward the celebration of Christmas, you can't avoid Christmas. You can reinterpret it or decide it doesn't mean anything and it's just a traditional holiday. That's fine. But as we move toward that, because you can't avoid it, I want to invite you to consider reframing your life around or re-inviting the person of Jesus back into your framework. And it doesn't have to be the version that you left as a child or the version that you left as a college student, but I want you to at least consider it. Now, I've been doing this a long time, so I know how some of us think. I know how I would think. And for some of you, you would say, you know what, that's interesting. And if it's just an purely academic exercise, and if it's just purely a mental exercise, okay, I may follow you through this. But you need to understand, Andy, I feel like the price of admission or the price of readmission, the price of saying I'm going to somehow recreate a framework around something religious or something that has to do with Jesus, I feel like the price is too high because I think the price would be my mind. Because of course, your assumption, and I understand this, your assumption is that Christianity requires faith, and that faith leaves in its wake reason and experience. Here's some great news, and perhaps no one told you this before. The original version of Christianity did not require anyone to sacrifice what they observed, what they knew, and what they experienced. You may feel like the price of readmission is your freedom, and you're right about that, because following Jesus or reframing your life around the person of Jesus, it will cost you something. It will require you to say no to you. But hey, every frame of reference, every worldview, every you view requires you to say no to you. Because regardless of your frame of reference, you have some oughts, correct? You have some ought nots. Regardless of your frame of reference, you have some regrets. You have some things you wish you could go back and undo. So the whole idea of having to say no to you is not new. It's just which no is going to be part of your frame of reference besides. There may be a fatal flaw to your current frame of reference. And the fatal flaw, this is the offensive part, it might be you. I mean, come on, what do you know? What do we know? What do you know? What do we know? At every season, isn't this true? At every season of our life, our frame of reference changes. I mean, we hated our parents for taking us to the dentist, and now we drive ourselves. What happened? At every season of life, this begins to change. So who's to say? I mean, come on, let's just be honest. Isn't it true that at every season of life, and as you learn and grow, your frame of reference continues to morph and change? So isn't it possible that your current non-religious or non-Christian or non-whatever frame of reference, isn't it possible that it's incorrect? I mean, you remember, you were absolutely sure. You were sure she was the one. You were sure he was the one. And now you're looking for a way out, right? We had to have it. You remember it. You leased it, you bought it, you borrowed money for it. You had to have it. We had to have it. Now we wish we'd never purchased it. We had to go. I just got to be there. I've got to go. I just can't miss it. Doesn't matter how much it costs. I have to be there. And now you wish you'd never gone. So, just to bother you, come on, what do we know? Because here's what I know about you, and here's what you know about me. My frame of reference, your frame of reference, my worldview, your worldview, my way of seeing and interpreting the events of the world, and your way of seeing and interpreting the events of the world, it's limited. Now, here's what Christians believe. In fact, if you grew up as a Christian, you may not know that this is what you believe because no one told you, and I'm so sorry about that. In fact, it's one of the reasons you left, and it's one of the reasons it was so easy for you to believe. Christians believe that while mankind has continued to grow in our knowledge, because we're able to write things down and pass it on generation to generation to generation, that while all of that happened over time, that God rushed ahead so that we could know what God is like. So that instead of our knowledge building and building and building, and finally there's a breakthrough one day and we finally discover what God is really like, God did something extraordinary. And what Christians believe, and what I want you to reconsider if you don't consider it or if you've abandoned this way of thinking, Christians believe that God sent someone to our side of the frame to be a point of reference. And the Bible, the English Bible, is divided into two parts. You probably know that. There's the Old Testament and New Testament. And in that second half of our English Bibles, there's a document called Hebrews. It's called Hebrews because it's a sort of a long sermon that was written to Jewish people in the first century. Jewish people who, get this, who had decided that Jesus was their Messiah. And so the author of this document we call Hebrews actually writes this sermon to say to them, hey, do not abandon your faith. Don't walk away from your faith in Jesus. And he tells them why they shouldn't. And the answer to the question of why they shouldn't walk away from a framework that was built around the fact that God sent someone to our side of the frame to be our point of reference, the answer to the question why they shouldn't walk away was really just one word. So I want to read you a few verses from this document. Then I want to ask you a question, and then we'll be done. Here's what he wrote. He said, therefore, and this first part is so amazing. He says, therefore, since we have, past tense, present tense, since we have a great high priest, which that's, the Jewish people got into that because the high priest was the person between the rest of the world and God. Since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, since we have him, that's the reason we should hold firmly to the faith we profess. Now, this is the whole shooting match right here in a couple of verses. Here's what he's saying, or let me tell you what he's not saying. He's not saying, since everything is going well, since everything is working out, since we've got everything we need, since we've resolved all the mysteries of the universe, since we have resolved all of our wonder, since we have answers to all of our questions, let's continue to follow Jesus. That's not what he says. That's what we want. But he says, no, since there is Jesus, since God sent Jesus, we should hold firmly to the faith we profess. Later, he says this, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Now, he's just gone through a list of Jewish heroes who did extraordinary things that most of them are documented in the Jewish scripture. He says, since we have this whole group of people behind us, here's what we should do going forward. And the reason he leverages this great group of people that were famous to Jewish people, not so much to those of us who aren't Jewish, is this, that the Jewish people believed that God was going to do something in the world for the world. Jewish people believed since the time of Abraham that God was going to do something in the world for the entire world, which was preposterous because Abraham said that God told him that he would become a family and become a nation, and that through that nation, this was the part that in ancient times didn't make any sense, that the entire world would be blessed. And so everybody following Abraham believed that God was going to do something in the world for the world, in the world for the world, in the world for the world. And Abraham died and didn't see that promise fulfilled. And the generation after Abraham died and didn't see that promise fulfilled. And the generation after that died and didn't see that promise fulfilled. And the author of Hebrews says, hey, listen, you need to hang on to this faith that centers on and frames out who Jesus is, because many, many, many generations have come and gone hanging on to, clinging to the promise that God was going to do something in the world for the world. And folks, God has done something in the world for the world. So if that group of people were able to maintain faith as they looked forward to something, how much more so those of us who have experienced the fulfillment of that promise in our world? That they were on the fulfillment side of the promise. They were on the fulfillment side of all those predictions. God had in fact done something in the world. So he's saying to his audience, hey, why would you let go of the very thing that God had promised? And these people, they believed even though they didn't see it fulfilled. They they clung to that promise. They went to their deathbed going, I wonder if we're wrong. I wonder if that's going to happen. I wonder if what we were told God told Abraham is true. And in fact, it turned out God has done something in the world for the world. So he said to his first century audience, of all people, of all generations, we need to maintain our faith. God has done what the people who came before us believed he would eventually do in the world. And he says this, so therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders, anything that gets in the way of that, and the sin that so easily trips us up or entangles us or gets all wrapped around our ankles. For some of you, here's what that verse means. The sin, because you were raised with a religious frame of reference, the sin, because you were raised maybe in church, the sin that caused you to feel guilt. And then you got tired of feeling guilty. And there were only two ways to resolve it. Either you dive back into this frame of reference that says what you're doing is wrong, or you get a new frame of reference. You decide none of that's true. You decide perhaps there is no God, or if there's a God, it's not a personal God, and that impersonal God could care less how you live your life. And you changed your frame of reference, and the guilt level went down, and the shame level went down. And suddenly you felt better about yourself, even though you hadn't changed anything you were doing or not doing. You just changed the way you viewed the world. How did I know? Because for year after year after year, I've heard that story. Andy, I just got tired of feeling guilty, and I didn't want to stop, and I didn't want to get out of the relationship, and I didn't want to change my way of living. So I just dismissed the entire frame of reference that told me I was wrong. But do you know what else I hear? And maybe this is your experience as well. That even though I changed my worldview, even though I got a new window, even though I began to see the world differently, There was something on the inside that was never resolved. I was never fully, be honest, I was never fully at peace. And he goes on, he says, and let us run with perseverance or endurance the race that's marked out for us. In other words, there is a frame of reference for our lives. There's a frame of reference that allows us to know who God is and how we're to live our lives, in spite of what we know or don't know, scientifically. And this frame of reference, this organizational principle, this true north, this big idea, this framework for everything, it's not a philosophy and it's not a religion, it's a person. And the next few words that he says are so extraordinarily important, and this is the reason we're talking about it. He says to this Jewish group of people, look, you are on the fulfillment side of this promise that God made to the world. God has fulfilled his promise by sending his son into this world. And men and women, he would say, you're beginning to lose focus. You're beginning to lose perspective. And I need you to refocus your attention, not on a book, not on an institution, not on a church, not on a leader, but on a specific person. And this is so powerful. Fixing your eyes, or fixing our eyes on Jesus. Now, real quick. Your religious upbringing, whether it was in church or synagogue or temple or whatever it might be, or maybe your marginal religious experience as a kid, maybe you didn't grow up going to church, but you just sort of had this general kind of religious thing that followed you around. Chances are your religious framework, regardless of how tightly defined it was or loosely defined it was, chances are it focused you on something. Perhaps it focused you on the pastor or the priest because he was so great or she was so great and they were so funny or they were so relevant. Or maybe they focused you on the church. It was all about church. You got to be in church. It's Sunday. We got to be in church. You got to be in church. You got to be in God's house. Or perhaps it was the Bible. This is God's holy word. It's all true. We don't understand most of it, but it's all true. It's confusing, but it's all true. It's God's holy word. And so they fixed your eyes on a book. Or perhaps they fixed your eyes on an experience. Maybe it was that camp experience, or after church, you went down and signed a card and somebody older than you presented you to the church, or you went through confirmation. You had an experience and they said, see there, you're in. You're one of us. You're a Christian. You're a whatever because of the experience. Or maybe circumstances. Maybe you grew up in a religious framework or had a religious framework that was all about God coming through and God answering prayer, and see if you do the right thing, the right things will happen. And if you say the right things will happen. And if you hang out with the right people, the right things will happen. And you did all of that and the right things didn't happen. This is why so many people who grow up with even a Christian framework walk away from their Christianity. Because unfortunately, the group they grew up with fixed their eyes on something other than what the author of Hebrews and the writers of the New Testament tell us we're to fix our eyes on. We're to fix our eyes on Jesus. Why? He tells us. Because Christianity didn't begin with church. And Christianity didn't begin with a book. And Christianity didn't begin with an organization. It didn't even begin with a philosophy. It didn't even begin with theology. That Christianity began with a person. The person that God sent to our side of the frame to be a point of reference. The person that God sent to our side of the frame so that while we caught up with all of God's mystery of the universe, the mystery of the human body, the mystery of life, that in the meantime we could know where we stood with him. Here's how he says it. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer, that is the founder and the originator of faith. Again, Christianity didn't begin with a philosophy or a theology or a belief system. It began with a person. He says this, not only the pioneer, but also the perfecter of faith. That is one that's a person that brings something to a successful conclusion, a perfect landing, the perfect parallel parking. He says that Jesus is the author and the originator of our faith. The whole thing stems from him. It all rests on him. And he says this, who for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And then these powerful two words, because he's drawing them back in to a different frame of reference, the one that they had lost focus of. He says to them, and I think he says to me, and I think he says to you, consider him. Consider him. Reconsider him. Consider his life. not what you've been told about him. Consider his teaching, not necessarily what you've been taught. Consider his claims, not necessarily the things that people have claimed about him. And here it is. So that you, his first century audience, and you, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart or lose faith. The reason perhaps that you walked away from a frame of reference that referenced Jesus is because perhaps somewhere along the way, your focus was no longer Jesus. It was something or it was someone else. Because God showed up on our side of the frame to be our point of reference. So here's a question as we wrap this up. If once upon a time you wondered and then you wandered, if at some point in the past, maybe college, maybe right after college, maybe right out of high school, or after your parents got a divorce, or your brother went through that horrific thing and everybody prayed, the preacher said, if we have enough faith, he'll be healed, and he wasn't healed, and then everybody went on with their lives and pretended like nothing bad had happened, and you were just left spinning in the wind. If you wondered and then you wandered, here's the question that I'd love you to consider. What was the faith that you lost, fixed on, and fastened to? If at one point you wondered because it just didn't make sense anymore, and you did away with the religious framework, and you did away with Christianity, and you did away with the church, here's my question for you as I invite you back as we approach the celebration of Jesus' birthday. What was your faith fixed on and fastened to? And my hunch is this: it was not fixed on and it was not fastened to Jesus. It was something or someone else. And the reason it was so easy for you to wander, the reason it was so easy for you to jettison that frame of reference is because circumstantial and experience-based faith, circumstantial, that if it all works out, God's for me. If it doesn't work out, where's God? Circumstantial-based faith, experience-based faith will not survive the pleasures or the pressures of life. In fact, the pleasures and the pressures of life eventually make faith inconvenient and implausible. So, if you wondered and then you wandered, here's something to ponder. Perhaps your eyes got fixed on the wrong thing. Perhaps your eyes got fixed on the wrong person. That's something to wonder about. And hopefully, it'll create enough wonder that you'll wander back here next week for part 2 of Welcome to Wonderland. Hey everybody, welcome to Your Move. I'm Andy Stanley. What do you wonder? Yeah, what do you wonder? You know, theists like me, we wonder why God allows bad things to happen to good people. Non-theists wonder why us theists are so naive, which makes me wonder, who's right? So let's talk about wonder right here on Your Move.
What do I wonder?
I wonder what life will be like for my family in 5 years.
Well, basically, I'm wondering if I'll just make the right choices.
And I wonder if there's really somebody out there guiding us.
I wonder if I'm going to have a very fulfilled life and do what I'm supposed to do.
So what about you? What do you wonder? What do you wonder? And as you listen to those voices and as you listen to those questions, what do you wonder? We all wonder. And sometimes wonder leads to fear, right? In fact, sometimes we wonder because we're afraid. But sometimes wonder leads to courage. Sometimes wonder leads to discovery. In fact, some of the greatest discoveries, some of the greatest breakthroughs in science and education and other arenas began with somebody wondering I wonder if, since the moon is round and the sun seems to be round, if perhaps the earth is round as well. We all wonder, in fact, if there is a God, and I believe there's a personal God, I think perhaps one of God's greatest gifts to me and God's greatest gifts to you and to all of us is the ability to think about the future and to wonder. But as we said in part one of this series, we actually all wonder through a specific framework. And we're illustrating that framework or that frame of reference with this window. And we all are limited in our ability to see the world the way the world really is because our framework doesn't provide us with all the answers. So consequently, theists wonder, we wonder why in the world would God allow bad things to happen to good people? Some of you wonder how natural selection could provide stardust and energy with the ability to wonder. So we all wonder, but we all wonder through a very, very specific frame of reference. Now, Christians believe, and Christians have believed from the very beginning, that God actually sent someone to stand on our side of the frame to serve as a reference, to stand inside our world on our side of the frame to serve as a reference, so that in spite of all that we wonder about, in spite of all that we know and don't know, in spite of where we are on the continuum of discovery as it relates to science, the universe, the human body and life, and all the other things that we're constantly upgrading and updating our knowledge around, that in spite of all that we could know with certainty what God is like. In fact, there's a first century writer, we looked at something that he or she said, we don't know who wrote this. We call it the Book of Hebrews. It's actually just a sermon that was written in the first century. And this first century author says to his audience who was beginning to lose focus in terms of their focus of Christianity and their religious frame of reference, he makes this statement we looked at in part one. He says this, or she says this, whoever wrote it said this, and I love this statement, fixing our eyes on Jesus, who is the pioneer and the perfecter of faith. And in this one simple statement, there is so much that is so extraordinarily rich. Because with this one simple statement, the author reminds us that the issue as it relates to Christianity is always Jesus. That when it comes to a Christian worldview or a Christian frame of reference, the issue is not a theology, it's not a philosophy, it's not even a belief system, it is a person. That Christianity begins and ends with a person. It begins and ends with Jesus. So for those of you today, I want to talk to two groups. I want to talk to the group of you who would say, you know what, I grew up in kind of with a Christian frame of reference. I grew up with somewhat of a Christian worldview. But Andy, then I just ran into things, I experienced things, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I just felt like I had to leave. And then there's another group of you that's thinking about leaving. In fact, you may consider yourself a Christian. As far as your parents know, you are in. You prayed the prayer. You know, you've got the book. You know, you've read the Bible. But you're having these conversations constantly, and you're not so sure how long you can stay in. And there's a sense in which you're kind of leaning toward, or you're reaching for the handle of faith to say, you know what, I think I have to leave. Because my experience in life just doesn't line up with the faith I was handed as a child, or the faith that I adopted as a teenager, or the faith that I adopted while I was in school, college, or graduate school. And maybe the seeds were sown for you to leave whatever religious world you grew up in. Maybe the seeds were sown in childhood because you were taught to view the world a certain way, but you realize that even your parents weren't on the same page, and later on it made it easier to question and to leave. Or perhaps you were raised in an extraordinary home, almost a perfect home. And yet as you got outside your perfect home, you realized the world didn't line up with your perfect home and with your perfect belief system. Or perhaps it was when you went to school. When you went to school, you discovered things you'd never discovered before, never been taught before. And whether it was high school or college or graduate school or med school or law school, as you continue to build and build and build your education, here's something you shouldn't deny and we can't deny, that our education becomes a filter through which we see and view and interpret the world. And then there's this one, our religious experience, whether it was in a church or a temple or a mosque. This began early on for many of us to be a filter through which we viewed and interpreted the world. And again, you may have had an extraordinary church or temple or mosque experience. Or perhaps you had a disruptive one. Or perhaps, like many people in the South especially, you grew up with a very legalistic one. And you felt like if you weren't perfect, you couldn't stay. And your older brother and your older sister, they were perfect. This worked for them. It just didn't work for you. And whether or not this is still a part of your life or used to be a part of your life, here's something you can't deny and we shouldn't deny. That whatever kind of religious upbringing we had, whether we stayed with it or walked away from it, it jaded us. It became a filter through which we see all religion and all responses to religion. And then there's this. You screwed up, didn't you? You messed up. You have things in your life you hope no one knows about. You have regret. We all do. You violated your own rules. It may have begun by violating the rules that you were handed in your religious upbringing, but then you walked away from this perhaps, or you tweaked this, or you kind of edited this. But no matter how far away from this you drifted, there are things that you've done that you're just ashamed of. There's a season where you just the anger that you carried from whatever it was, whatever previous relationship it was, you know that it leaked out on the people around you. And this is the season of life you wish you could go back and undo. And to some extent, it was informed by this. And to some extent, you might have even excused it because of this. But this is a permanent part of your story, just as it is a permanent part of mine. Then, you got the worst news of your life. He didn't want to be married anymore. She didn't want to be married anymore. Your parents split up. You found out it was terminal, and you couldn't imagine life without him. You couldn't imagine life without her. We all have those pains in our window. And then there's this one. This is just that thing that you just can't get past. There's an insecurity that you live with, and it becomes a cage that locks you in and locks other people out. Or perhaps it's fear, and you don't know where the fear comes from. You just know you have more fear and more anxiety than the average person. And you've taken things for this, you've talked to people about this. Or this may be something to do with your physical body, your appearance. And it may be that thing in your appearance that no one else notices but you, but every time you look in the mirror, it is all you see. And it feeds this deep insecurity. And again, you know it's not rational. You know it's not logical. In fact, whenever it comes up in conversation, you're able to sort of laugh about it. But it is so deep. It is that thing that keeps you from going, that keeps you from showing up, that keeps you from speaking up, that keeps you from living life. Now, we're all adults, so hopefully we can all acknowledge this. We all want to think we are bigger than all of this. We all want to convince ourselves that this does not impact the way that we see the world. But that's not true. Your frame of reference is your frame of reference, and it is marked, and it is shaded, and it is jaded by things that you participated in and things that you had no control over. And the proof is this. Where oftentimes we cannot see how this has affected us in the mirror, it is very clear to us how these things have affected other people, right? When you heard your dad's entire story, maybe it was after he passed away and your mom finally told you, or a grandparent finally told you, it was like, oh, now I know why he was the way he was. When we get a glimpse of other people's frame of reference, their life makes sense to us, and we know that their experience and their response and their responses are a reflection of what's in the window panes of their life. And my friends, come on. It's true of me. It's true of you. Now here's the powerful, powerful thing. When Jesus showed up on the planet, his first century followers, they had a window frame full of jaded panes. When he showed up, the frame of reference was so distorted, it was so off, it was so marked, it was so marred, that the first century frame of reference included things like this, that if you're sick, it's because God is punishing you. And if you're healthy, it's because God loves you. This is what people believed. They believed that God loved the wealthy people, that's why they were wealthy. And if you were poor, or if you had a disease or an illness, it's because God had cursed you and was angry with you. This was how they viewed the world. They, in terms of the afterlife, their religious leaders weren't even consistent on whether or not there's anything on the other side of this. So they wondered, is there more to life than this life? And so God did for them what he ultimately did for us. He sent someone. He sent someone. He sent someone to stand on their side of the frame to serve as a frame of reference. This is what Christmas is really all about. Toward the end of Jesus' life, he told his guys, he said, hey, listen, I want to celebrate Passover together. Now, they didn't know it, but this would be their last Passover together. Because a few hours after Passover, Jesus would be arrested and tried and ultimately crucified. And so he's got the guys together, and it's fabulous, interesting, intricate conversations that he has with them. And during one of these conversations, the Apostle John documents this for us. And the Apostle John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the fourth gospel writer, wrote some letters. 3 of them were preserved, became part of the New Testament. During this conversation, Jesus gives them the worst news possible. He says, guys, just heads up, I'm leaving. Wait. We didn't want to come here to begin with, okay, to Jerusalem, and now you're leaving? And they took that to mean like, you guys stay here, I'm leaving, okay? And if Jesus leaves, they're in trouble because the only reason they weren't already arrested is because they were with Jesus, and wherever Jesus went, there was a crowd, and the crowds protected Jesus. Now it's late at night, they're in this upper room, it's this secret place. They made sure nobody knew exactly where they were, and they're celebrating Passover together, and Jesus says, oh yeah, by the way, I'm leaving. So Simon Peter, who was generally the spokesman for the guys, said this. Simon Peter said, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus replied, where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. To which Peter must have thought, that's not what I asked, but that is what I meant. How does he do that? Peter asked, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. And here's what he's probably thinking. Okay, if I stay here, I'm probably going to lay down my life anyway because they're going to arrest the rest of us because the crowd follows you, the crowd doesn't follow us if they know you've left. And so if I'm going to lay down my life, I want to lay down my life with you and for you. Or perhaps he thought maybe you're leaving to proclaim yourself as Messiah. But Jesus, I just want you to know, wherever you go, you can count on me. You can take me because I will stand with you and I'm willing to die for you if needs be. And you know what Peter was doing? Peter was doing what we all do all the time. He was looking at life through the window of his own insecurity, what he was taught about Messiah, his own failures, and the disappointments that he'd experienced in life. And he says, Jesus, count on me, count on me. And then Jesus, I think he smiled. I don't think Jesus was angry in this moment. Jesus smiles, and the text says, and Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? And he's like, oh yeah, I will. And he puts his hand on his shoulder perhaps, and he says, no, very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, that is before the sun gets high in the sky, you're gonna disown me. Not only are you not gonna lay down your life for me, you're gonna disown me 3 times. Well, this is so disturbing. I mean, this just doesn't make any sense. And then a few verses later, Jesus, again, the master teacher, he says to this same very troubled group of men, guys, do not let your hearts be troubled. But Jesus, you just told us you're leaving. And then this next statement Jesus makes, and again, I wish we had time to delve into the complexities of this, but this next statement, they should have all gotten up and left the room. Seriously, this next statement he makes, they should have said, okay, that's it. We have followed you through a lot of things. We have sat through some very strange sermons, but that's it. We can't follow you anymore. He said to them, and John documents it, and John believed it. And now he says to you, and he says to me, guys, don't you believe in God? Yeah. Well, believe also in me. Guys, don't you believe in God the way you understand God out there somewhere? Yeah, we do. Jesus says, hey, look. Believe also in me, to which they're like, wait, hang on. Okay. Telling us about God is one thing. Claiming equality to God, that's something entirely different. Telling us about God, explaining God. In fact, that's what we want you to do. We want you to explain God to us because we want to understand. But to sit in the room with us and look at us and say, hey, look at me, you believe in God, you can believe in me the same way you believe in God. We can't do that. That's blasphemous. This is the kind of thing that gets you in trouble all the time. And then he goes into this thing that perhaps if you grew up in church, you heard as a child, and maybe you heard it said a little differently. Each translation tries to capture the tone of these interesting words. He says, my Father's house, God's house, has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? What are you even talking about? And it keeps going. And if I go and prepare a place for you, Peter, pay attention, I will come back and I will take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. And now it's starting to dawn on them. And then he says this, and by the way, guys, you seem so confused, but you know the way to the place where I'm going. You know the way to the place where I'm going. And they're like, no, we don't know where you're going. We don't know why you're going. We don't know why you feel like you have to leave and why you have to leave us and then you're going to take us there. And so Thomas is like, okay, raises his hand or maybe just blurts out. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going. So how can we know the way? If we're going to get to where you're going, we need to know the way there. And then Jesus makes a statement that's famous now, but is usually ripped completely out of this incredible, incredible context. In fact, if you're not a Christian, this is one of those things maybe Christians have said to you and it's like, okay, I can't go there. Or maybe if you're reaching for the door to leave, it's because of the way this next phrase has been interpreted for you. Because this next statement that Jesus makes has been used by the church to exclude people and to stiff-arm people. But when you read it within this context, Jesus is not trying to keep anybody out. Jesus is trying to make the case. I've come to your side of the frame of reference to be a reference because your heavenly Father wants everybody in. Why do you think I'm here? Thomas says, Jesus, just show us the way. If you'll tell us the way, we'll get on that path and we'll be there, whenever you want us there. And Jesus smiles and says, looks at them because they're all looking out here, show us the way. And Jesus says, I am the way. Guys, it's not out there somewhere. You don't have to figure this out. You don't have to work past what you knew or didn't know. You don't have to work past all of your pain. And there's things that you learned as kids, that was helpful, some not so helpful. Guys, he would say, look at me. You're looking at the way. You don't have to figure out what is truth. Guys, you're looking at as much truth as you'll ever be able to comprehend about God in this lifetime. And then he does that equate himself with God thing. Again, no one comes to the Father except through me. And this wasn't a ha, you can't get to God unless you line up in front of me. His point was, instead of trying to figure out what it's like on the other side, the invitation is wide open to every single person, regardless of their pain, regardless of what they know and don't know, regardless of how they were raised, regardless of what they've done. And regardless of how they viewed God before this, and regardless of their fear and their insecurity, everybody is welcome, and everybody, this is a statement of equality, not exclusion, and everybody gets in the very same way. If you really knew me, he says, if you really know me, you will know my Father as well. Wait a minute. You're telling us to know you is to know the Father? That's what I'm telling you. You would know the Father as well. From now on, you do know him, and you have seen him. Again, they're so literal. Of course they are. It's like, wait, no, we haven't seen him. So they're going back and forth. My father's house. We didn't know your father had a house. It's not the temple. You're talking about dying and coming back, or we're going with you. We don't want to die, but if we die, what are you talking about? So then Philip said, Lord, okay, show us the Father. I love this. And that will be enough for us. Okay, I'm sure what you just said is really important. We got, we've written it down. But for us simple men, we just want to know what God is like and if God likes us. Help us see clearly in spite of our sin. Help us see clearly in spite of and in light of and along with our fabulous or not so fabulous education. We want to see God, maybe not the God we were presented with as children, but if part of that's true or some of that's true, that's fine too. We just want to know. We want to know how much of this is true, and we need to be able to see past our fear and past our insecurity and past our inability and unwillingness to interact at the level that sometimes we want to, but we're just afraid. Jesus, Just help all of us. We're all different men and our windows look different, but we just want to see God. And Jesus said, don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you for such a long time. Philip, look. Philip, quit looking out there. Look, right here. I'm in the room with you. I'm here with you. Guys, I know that you're tired of me saying these things. I know this is offensive. I know that if this gets outside the room, we're all in trouble. But anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Your heavenly Father wants you to see. Your heavenly Father wants to be clear. Your heavenly Father wants you to know what your heavenly Father is like. He wants you to see. That's why he sent me. That with all the mysteries and all the wondering and all there is yet to be discovered and figured out, in the meantime, your heavenly Father wanted this to be clear. So he sent a person. Then he says this, and this is the issue. This is the whole thing right here. Believe me. Believe me. Everything else is secondary. Everybody else is secondary. This is where the clarity comes from. Not all of that. This. Believe me. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. And then the next part is fabulous. He didn't ask them just to believe because he said it. He goes further than that. He would know that later generations would need more evidence. And so he says, or at least, believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Now let me tell you why this is so important. We're going to wrap up. Why in the world does this confused group of people who keep asking the same question over and over and over and can't seem to get it, why is it that after they watched Jesus die the most shameful death imaginable, why is it they walked into the streets, the very streets where he was ultimately arrested, why is it they were able to walk into those same streets and proclaim that Jesus was in fact the Son of God, the Messiah that the Jews had been waiting for all along? Why? It was not what he taught. It's not what he said. It wasn't that little pep rally challenge in the upper room during Passover. It was because of the resurrection. Their faith was reborn based on the evidence of the works themselves. When they saw him alive, they fixed their eyes on Jesus and they never took him off, and they changed the world. Jesus' point is simply this. And if you left, this is the point I want to leave with you. And if you're thinking about leaving, this is the point I want you to consider before you leave. And if you've never been on the inside of the Christian faith and you've always stood on the outside because there's so many unanswered questions, or maybe you knew too many Christians, who knows? Here's the thing to ponder. If you look past me, stop short of me, or take your eyes off of me, you may miss the Father. I am as close, Jesus would say, I am as close as you'll ever come to knowing what God is like in this life. I am as close as you'll ever know what God is like in this life. Fix your eyes on me. So, if you've wondered and then you wandered, here's that thing you need to ponder. Come on. What was the faith? What was the faith you lost, fixed on, and fastened to? What was the faith that you lost, fixed on, and fastened to? Or if you're looking for the door, what is the faith? What is the faith you're losing, fixed on, or fastened to? Is it the church? That's not what you're to fix your eyes on. Is it a version of Christianity that dissed science or labeled people? That's not what you're supposed to fix your eyes on. Is it something in the Old Testament? If you're hung up on something in the Old Testament, Jesus would say, okay, I understand that. I understand how you were taught. I understand how you were raised. I understand what happened, but I'm just telling you, it's a new day. Fix your eyes on me. Were your eyes fixed on, or are your eyes fixed on some version of faith that says, bad things can't, a good God wouldn't let bad things to happen to good people? Jesus would smile and say, are you kidding me? Are you kidding? The worst thing imaginable happened to the best possible person. I don't know where you got that idea. You did not get that from my Father in heaven. Fix your eyes on me. Because here's the bottom line. We will always wonder. But in the days of Caesar Augustus, the son of the divine Julius, God sent his son to be the light of the world, to stand with us so we would not have to wonder where we stood with him. That's the one thing we never, ever have to wonder about. Hey everybody, welcome to Your Move. I'm Andy Stanley, and today we are talking about wonder. And while there are many things you could wonder about, one of the things you should not wonder about is God's love for you. Stick around and we'll talk about it right here on Your Move.
What do you wonder? That's good. I thought it was going to be super specific, and I was going to be way not ready to answer.
I wonder why everybody's so angry about everything.
I would also say that I'm a religious person, so I wonder about God and why things happen.
I wonder what life will be like for my family in 5 years.
When I wonder about God, I wonder if we would laugh together, if we would sing or tell jokes, and just kind of what our interaction would be when we first meet each other.
So, what do you wonder? What do you wonder? I wonder why it's so difficult to do the healthy thing when I'm so concerned about my health. You ever wonder about that? Those of us who believe in God, we wonder about heaven, don't we? We wonder what it's going to be like. We wonder, are we really going to see the people we love? Are they going to look the same? Are we going to be able to meet famous people? If you're a non-theist, you wonder how we could be so naive as to believe there is a place called heaven, and how is it that we continue to hold on to these myths that, should have been let go generations ago. But at the same time, if you're a non-theist, you wonder about life after death, don't you? You wonder if there's something else. And when you lose a loved one, you can't help but wonder, is there more? And we all wonder through a frame of reference, and the frame of reference is inadequate because the frame of reference doesn't provide us with all the answers and all the information that we need. But there's another reason we wonder as well. We talked about this last time. We wonder because our frame of reference isn't clear. Our frame of reference is cluttered with life. Our frame of reference is cluttered with our personal life experiences. And we want to think we're better than this, don't we? We want to think we're smarter than this. We want to think that we've moved beyond this. We want to think that the pain in our lives doesn't impact the way that we see the world, that somehow we've moved beyond that. But that's virtually impossible. And the way that you see the world is impacted by your childhood, whether it was a great childhood or a not so great childhood. The truth is that's a filter through which you view the world, through which you interpret relationships. And then there's those fears and those insecurities and those things that just don't ever quite go away, and it becomes a part of a filter. And all of these things create a filter through which we see the world. And so we wonder, but we don't simply wonder through a frame of reference with limited information. We wonder through a frame of reference that's full of life experiences. Now, Christians believe something that's a little bit odd. That's why we're talking about it. Christians believe that God actually became one of us to clarify these things for us. That God actually became one of us so that we could understand, so that we could see more clearly. That he sent someone to our side of the frame to serve as a reference. So in spite of all the things that we can't know, in spite of all the things that we will never know, that we could know where we stood with him. And so for the last couple of weeks, we've looked at this little phrase, this verse written in the first century by somebody who was writing specifically to Jewish people in the first century, and this document, it's called Hebrews. It's called the book of Hebrews, but it's not really a book. It's really like a long sermon. And in his attempt to reach out to Jewish people in his community who had put their faith in Jesus, but were beginning to wander away, he made this powerful, powerful observation. Here's what he said. He said, we're to fix our eyes on Jesus. We're to fix our eyes on Jesus, who is the pioneer, the one that started it all off, and the perfecter of our faith. He said there's going to be a lot of things that distract you. There are going to be a lot of things you don't ever know. There are going to be a lot of life experiences that don't add up. But we're to fix our eyes on the person of Jesus, not church, not our church experience, not necessarily the things that happened to us or the things that didn't happen for us in life, but to fix our eyes on Jesus. So if you've wandered away, if you wondered and then you wandered away, or as we said last time, if you're sort of reaching for the door of faith, isn't it true the problem really isn't Jesus? And so the question we've asked, and the question I want to ask one more time is this: what was the faith? What was the faith you've lost, fixed on, or fastened to? Or what is the faith you are losing? What is the faith that is slowly slipping away, fixed on, or fastened to? And as we approach the Christmas season, I want to encourage you, I want to plead with you, would you spend some time refastening or fixing your eyes on Jesus? Not church, not Christians, not necessarily the way that you were raised, not necessarily what you were taught, but would you fix your eyes on the person of Jesus? Now, today, as we continue the discussion, I want to address one obstacle that may stand in the way of you doing that, especially if you've stepped outside of faith and you think the whole idea of stepping back in or even considering or reconsidering if that just seems like it's just unimaginable to you. Perhaps this is one of the reasons you find that so difficult. Because the assumption is, and these aren't your words, these are words perhaps I put around one of your thoughts. The assumption is this, that Christianity requires mind-numbing, experience-denying faith. And faith becomes the problem. That to be a Christian, to step back inside this whole idea, to consider Jesus or to stay in this box that you feel like has become a box of religion or Christianity, it requires you to have mind-numbing, experience-denying faith. Here's what I want you to know. That the original version did not. That Jesus' original followers did not pretend things were better than they were. And Jesus' original followers were never asked by Jesus not to look, to pretend, or just to believe and believe. And the reason this is so confusing sometimes is because there's so much misunderstanding about this word faith. So today I want to talk specifically about this. And the reason it's so confusing, I'll own this, is because guys like me, men and women like me, have made faith complicated and they've made faith confusing. And by creating confusion around faith, we are responsible for causing some people to wander away from the faith. And I think the church oftentimes is responsible for causing some people to never even consider faith. So what is faith? And what's the role, especially as it relates to Christianity? So a couple things it's not. First, because perhaps you heard this growing up, faith is not some sort of force and it's not some sort of power. Faith isn't some sort of invisible lasso that we get around God's neck, and if we have enough faith, and if enough people have enough faith, we can get God to do things that God wasn't planning on doing. And perhaps the church that you were raised in taught that. And perhaps that's one of the reasons you walked away, because you believed and believed and believed, and you prayed and you prayed and you prayed, and the pastor came over and prayed for your mom or for your sister or came to the hospital, and everybody prayed and everybody believed and everybody had extraordinary faith. And they prayed powerful prayers, loud prayers. And God didn't answer them. And so as God didn't answer your prayers, you begin to wonder, is there a God that can be trusted? Is there a God at all? That faith is not a power or a force we tap into. Do you know what that is? That's called magic. That's called paganism. That is not Christian or Jewish faith. And faith is not a formula. Faith is not something you have to figure out. There's not a pen code. There's not a code that you get the code and then God starts spitting stuff out. It's not complicated. It's not something you figure out. It's not a formula. Now here's the amazing thing. Many of us who grew up in church have actually heard what I'm about to explain or hear the verses I'm about to teach taught before, and this is the most amazing and confusing thing to me. I've heard pastors teach what I'm about to teach or teach the verses I'm about to teach, and the goal of the author of Hebrews is to make faith clear and understandable, and by the time they finish talking about what the author of Hebrews wrote, it is less clear and it is more confusing, and they actually use these verses to convince people that faith is something very different than what the author of Hebrews says it is. And the author of Hebrews says that faith is simple and faith is central. But here's the big deal. Faith is not the reason we follow Jesus. Here's what he writes. He says this: now faith is confidence in what we hope for. Now he's introduced another word. Now what is hope? Hope is wanting something to be with no guarantee. That's what hope is. Wanting something to be, but there's no guarantee. You hope to get a raise. You hope to get a bonus. You hope to get married. Heck, you hope to get a date, right? So faith happens, this is important. Faith happens, or faith is developed, or suddenly there's faith. Faith happens when hope so becomes confident something will be so. That faith becomes a reality when hope so moves to confidence that something will be so. But that leads us to another question, and that's this: what makes us confident hope so will be so? In other words, what has to happen for a hope so to be a be so? What has to happen inside us or around us so that something we hope will happen, suddenly we have absolute confidence that it absolutely will happen? So the author of Hebrews then basically makes the same statement a second way. He says this: now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and it's assurance about what we do not see. So once again, we're asking this question: okay, I believe what you're saying, but how do we get from hope so to assurance? And the answer is so simple, he doesn't even give us the answer because everybody knows the answer to this question. Let me help you, surface the answer for yourself. How will you know that you got the raise? When your boss walks in the office and says, I bet you've been hoping for a raise. The good news is I'm giving you a raise. And when your boss promises you a raise, hope goes to faith. The reason you know you're going to get a bonus is because somebody tells you you're going to get a bonus. And once they tell you, once they confirm it, then hope becomes faith. So let's go back to the text. So faith is confidence that God is and will do what he promised to do. This is basically the working definition of faith. That faith is confidence that God is and that he'll do what he promised to do. Now, this is very important for our discussion. We do not believe that God is because of faith. And we do not believe that God keeps God's promises because of faith. Faith is confidence that God is, and the reason we believe God is not because of faith. We believe God is because of evidence. And as we're going to see in just a few minutes, we don't believe God keeps his promises just because of faith. We believe God keeps his promises because God has kept his promises, as we are about to see. So faith is very simple. Faith is simply God with confidence that God is and that he will do what he has promised to do. So back to our text. Here's what the author says. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and it's assurance about what we do not see. And everybody reading this is like, that's exactly right. And you get the assurance once you get the promise. We know that. This, the author continues, this kind of faith, and then he gives us a whole bunch of illustrations. This is what the ancients were commended for. Now, if you read this text by yourself, and it's a powerful text, at this point, the author goes into a long list of what we're going to call the heroes of Judaism, or he calls them the ancients. And these were Jewish people reading this, so they knew all of these stories. So instead of teasing out all these stories, he just goes right through this list of people, some we've heard of and some we've not. And then for all of them, he says, by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. And what does he say? He says each of these people were given a promise, and they lived as if God existed and that God would keep that promise. That's what it means to live by faith. One of the ones he talks about is somebody most of us have heard of, Abraham. Just a quick survey, and if you're watching from home, I want you to participate. If you've heard of Abraham before you came today or before you turned on the television, would you raise your hand if you've heard of Abraham before? Yeah, you heard of him. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Okay, so one of the folks he talks about is Abraham, and he says Abraham left home. Well, why did Abraham leave home? He left home because God said, I want you to leave home and I'm going to show you a place that you don't know of. So Abraham believed God's promise and he acted on that promise. That's what faith is. Then most of us, probably all of us have heard of Moses. Moses left Egypt as a fugitive. Moses left Egypt with a price on his head. And we all know the story. Moses went back to Egypt. Now, why in the world would someone go back to the place that they barely escaped with their life from? Why would he do that? Because God said to Moses, I want you to go back. And if you'll go back, I promise I'm going to use you to deliver your people from Egyptian bondage. So faith is simple. Faith is believing God is based on evidence, not based on faith. And faith is believing that God will keep his promises, not based on faith, but based on the fact that we know God keeps God's promises. Now, here's the cool part, and here's why I'm going on and on about this. All of these heroes of the faith that he lists, all of these, the ancients as he talks about them, all of these ancients were commended by responding to God's promise, but all of them believed in God's global promise for the world. Because God spoke to Abraham about 2,000 years before Jesus shows up. This is amazing. About 2,000 years before Jesus shows up, God speaks to Abraham, and God made Abraham a promise. And all of these characters in the Jewish scripture, they knew God's promise to Abraham, and they lived their lives not only in light of God's personal promise to them, they lived their lives in light of God's global promise to the world. And here's what God said to Abraham about 2,000 years before the time of Jesus. This is amazing. He said, talking to Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. Wow, promise, put a check by that one. And I will bless you. Well, I'm thinking if you become a nation, you can consider yourself blessed. What did you do? Well, I became a nation. Oh, wow, that's cool. I will make your name great. This is why I asked you to raise your hand a minute ago. I will make your name great. 4,000 years ago, God tells a guy out in the desert, I'm going to make your name great. 4,000 years later, halfway around the world, just about everybody in this room and watching knows who Abraham is. I think God made Abraham's name great. You knew his name before you got here. Wow. Yeah. And then, that's just the warm-up act. I mean, he hasn't even got to the big one yet. This is the one that all the ancients lived in light of. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. What does that mean? And then you ready? This is phenomenal. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, when God made this promise to Abraham, this didn't make any sense because people didn't bless people. Tribes didn't bless tribes. Nations didn't bless nations. Not only did nations not bless other nations, nations conquered, pillaged, and enslaved other nations. And God says, no, something new is going to happen. And Abraham, I'm going to turn you into a nation. And your nation is not simply going to bless the surrounding tribes and families. Your nation is going to bless the entire earth. And my friends, that's the story of Christmas. Jesus being born onto this planet in the little town of Bethlehem was the fulfillment of a promise made 2,000 years ago. And all over the world today, people are gathering in the name of Jesus. And Jesus followers consider themselves blessed. God fulfilled this promise to Abraham. Now, back to the author of Hebrews. Here's what he says about this, because again, this is during the time right after Jesus had been crucified and rose from the dead. Here's what he said about these ancient Jewish people that were looking forward to this promise. All these people, talking about, everybody after Abraham, all the way up through the Old Testament, all of these people were still living by faith. This is such a cool phrase. All of these people were still living by faith when they died. All of these people were still living by faith when they died. What does that mean? That all of these people believed God was going to do something for the world through Abraham, but they didn't get to see it happen. They died before it happened, but they lived by faith. Every day of their lives, just about, they made decisions based on the fact that God keeps his promises. God kept his promise to them personally, and one day, someday, in a way we can't even begin to imagine, God is going to bless the world through our father, Abraham. Now, switching gears a little bit. Here's the reason this is so important as we approach Christmas. That both in the Jewish scriptures and in the New Testament scriptures, nobody assumed they could faith God into or talk God into anything. Nobody used faith as magic. Nobody used faith as leverage. People believed that God was God and that God could not be manipulated, that God was to be worshiped, but God could be trusted. That's the definition. That was the working definition of faith, that God is who God says he is. God keeps his promises. And the people in the Jewish scripture and the Christian scripture, they just lived their lives in light of that. In fact, one of my favorite little instances in the life of Jesus, now fast forwarding a little bit from the time of Abraham, Jesus is going along with his guys, and the scripture tells us, and we can't imagine this, that a man covered in leprosy approaches Jesus, which was so difficult for him to do, and he falls down at Jesus' feet. And he makes this statement, and I just think this is so precious. This is so powerful. This is an example of perfect faith. You ready? Here's what he said. Lord, which was a title of respect. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Not, Lord, I believe you will, I believe you will, I believe you will, I believe you will. My friends are back home praying, we believe you will, we believe you will. No, that's presumption. Lord, I have perfect faith. Don't miss this. I have perfect faith that if you are willing, you can. And why would a leper be absolutely confident that Jesus could heal him? And the answer is because he knew Jesus had healed other people. He did not go to Jesus because of faith. He went to Jesus because of evidence and because of what he'd seen, because of what he heard. He was absolutely confident that Jesus could do for him what he needed done. And I love what Jesus says. I love this. Jesus reached out his hand. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. This drove religious leaders crazy. You are not supposed to touch unclean things. And the amazing thing in the New Testament is this, that when Jesus touched unclean people, Jesus didn't acquire their disease. The opposite happened. They were healed. Jesus reached out and touched the man, and I love this, and he said, I am willing. In other words, that's all the faith I'm looking for. Not faith that you know I will, simply faith that you know I can. That is Jewish. That is Christian faith. Now, the problem is, if you were raised like a lot of people, you were not taught this definition of faith. You were taught that faith is more like a force, it's a power, it's some way you get God to do something. I mean, it's kind of spooky and maybe some crazy things happen in your church. And people resist this simple definition of faith. And I'll tell you why they resist it. And I'll tell you why preachers resist it. And I'll tell you why Christians resist it sometimes. Because it leaves God in control. So I have some good news for you. God is in control. And I'm so glad God did not listen to or answer my 16-year-old prayers. I would have had a Porsche. That would have been the end of me, right? And aren't you glad God didn't listen to some of your prayers? But at the same time, the reason you walked away is because God didn't answer some legitimate prayers. Isn't that right? And then, when God doesn't answer our prayer, when God doesn't come through, when things don't work out the way we were told it'll work out, if we had enough faith, if we prayed hard enough, if we were good little girls and boys, we lose faith. But we lose a faith that was founded on and based on something it was never to be based on to begin with. Now, here's why this is such a big deal to me personally. And this is why it should be a big deal to parents. And this is why it should be a big deal to those of you who've walked away from faith. An entire generation is abandoning faith because the church, and people like me, but because the church has signed God's name to promises God never made. So no wonder your faith fell apart. No wonder the whole thing crumbled. No wonder you couldn't maintain confidence in God. You were holding God accountable, or people taught you to hold God accountable to things God never promised to do. So if you grew up with vending machine God, the vending machine version of God, if you put in enough money and you put in enough time, you put in enough camps, you put in enough prayer, you put in enough Bible reading, something good's going to come out. Or if you were raised on the bad things never happen to good people, version of faith, of course you lost faith. That's not even Christian faith. That has nothing to do with the foundation of our faith. God never promised any of those things. But here's the fabulous news. God did not demonstrate his concern for you by promising nothing bad would happen. He did not demonstrate his love and concern for you by promising that every illness would be healed. And he did not demonstrate his love and concern for you by promising a flawless, perfect book. God's promise is far more full of wonder than any of those things. God's promise to you is more wonderful than any of those things. The Apostle Paul, who hated Christians, the Apostle Paul, whose life mission was to stamp out the church in the first century, the Apostle Paul, who eventually became a follower of Jesus and wrote letters that became part of our New Testament. The Apostle Paul said it this way, it's perfect. He said, but God demonstrates, that is, God put on a demonstration. God put on a demonstration to demonstrate his love for you, and it had nothing to do with making sure everything worked out for you and everything worked out for me. He did something way bigger than that. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, and the reason this was present tense for the Apostle Paul is that he was alive when Jesus died. So this is very personal to him. He was saying, while I was still a sinner, while I was still creating a whole lot of this, while I was still responding negatively and poorly to a whole lot of this, while I was trying to overcome some of this, while you were making decisions that you knew were contrary perhaps to God's will, or perhaps you made decisions and you didn't know anything about God's will, while you were still a sinner, the fact that God knew that you would live and knew that you would sin, God went ahead anyway, and he sent his son to die for us while we were still sinners. Christ died for us. This is the point. The trustworthiness, the wonderfulness, the trustworthiness, the wonderfulness of God was settled at the cross, not at an answered prayer. He came to our side of the window so that the one thing we would never have to worry about and wonder about was his love for us. Now, that's the message. That's the gospel. That's the point. That's the invitation. This is the wonder that we should never, ever lose. The wonder demonstrated at the cross, the wonder of his love. And here's the reason I just want to be as emphatic as I possibly can. The ancients, they looked forward and believed. We are on the other side of God fulfilling the big one, of God fulfilling the extraordinary one, the God fulfilling his promise to Abraham that I'm going to bless the nations through you, Abraham. And we are on the other side of that. And it is undeniable. It is unmistakably true. The evidence is not just built up and mounted. The evidence is overwhelming. He kept his promise to the world, and he kept his promise to you. So all of us, whether you're inside, outside, all of us, whether you're on the outside and wishing there was a way to get back in, whether you're on the inside and leaning out, all of us have been invited to do the one thing we should always do, to simply fix our eyes on Jesus. Not because of faith, because he has provided us with enough evidence to believe, while our minds continue to catch up with the wonder of this world, the wonder of creation. And I love this text, and I know I've read it to you before, but I just love it because of who wrote it. John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. He outlived all of his friends. I've told you this before. He lived through a chaotic time when he saw the whole city of Jerusalem destroyed. And yet with all that bloodshed, with all that terror, with all that experience, John, looking back, not looking back on his religious experience, not looking back on his schooling, not looking back on his sin, looking back at his time with Jesus, concluded this: in him, in spite of everything going on around, in him was life. And that life was the light of all mankind. And the light shines, and oh, this was so literal for him. The light shines in the darkness, and the world was so dark. And the darkness has not overcome or overwhelmed it. It didn't then, and it hasn't now. So, if you've wondered, and then because of some of this, you wandered, here's the last thing I would ask you to ponder. There will always be things that you wonder about. But God's love for you should never, ever be one of those things. And it won't be if you'll take your eyes off the people, the institutions, the hurt, and the broken promises, the things that have caused you over time to lose faith. And if you will fix your eyes on Jesus and the wonder of his love for you. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you check out the links on your screen for what to watch next, and check out the description below, where we are going to provide you with free resources designed to help you make better decisions and live with fewer regrets. And again, thanks for watching.